This time a year ago, I confess that I had very little positive to say, really, or to report about assets of community value. But things have improved an awful lot this year, as we'll see. But it will be interesting just hearing the experience of your local councils as well. And I'd love to record some of those examples that have been in the chat box. They look really good. Just very quickly, I'll cover the background of assets of community value, looking at the key issues and how the scheme operates. And then I'll look into the role of local councils and the limitations of the scheme. And I'll also touch on related opportunities that come from mapping community assets. And a lot of the themes that were coming up there were community asset transfers, which is, I know there's lots of these acronyms and terms, and it's all very similar, but they are different from assets of community value. So I will try and look at those. And so the 2011 Localism Act, it required district and unitary councils to maintain a list of assets of community value. And I'm going to start referring to this as ACVs. So I know people hate acronyms, but it just makes it so much easier. And these could be either land or buildings that are nominated by a local community group or a town and parish councils. And when they're listed, the assets, if they come up for sale or there's a change of ownership, then the regulation's aim was really to give the community group time to develop a bid and raise the money to buy the asset, but only if it came onto the open market. And these provisions are also known as the community right to bid. And the government said the goal was to give more communities the opportunity to take back control, that's a bit of a familiar saying there, of assets and facilities in their neighbourhoods, which we will come on to. And you've probably heard of the community right to bid. Well, this was intended as an essential element of the legislation and aimed to keep valued land and buildings in community use. And by giving local people the chance to bid or to buy and to safeguard property assets that they value in the community. But again, only to bid if and when they came onto the market. So that's quite a crucial element of all of this. And you can see some of the efforts from the slides here that were made by different communities. And some of these can be really quite high profile. So what defines an asset of community value? Well, an ACV is defined by legislation as a building or other land that furthers the social well-being or social interest of the local community, or it has done in the recent past. And in almost every neighbourhood, there's going to be buildings and amenities that are really integral to the communities that use them. And each community is free to decide for itself what it values. However, the Act strictly defines assets of community value in terms of its purpose, for which they're being or have been used, rather than the nature of the asset itself. So not in terms of any historical or architectural merit or any rarity value. And the Localism Act does state that social interest includes things like cultural, recreational and sporting interests. So there's a graph there I've just shown you, sort of almost like a tick box really of what applies and what doesn't. So assets could be things like village pubs, shops, community centres and library buildings. And many of these provide a base from which to deliver community services. And the Act also recognised that closure or sale of such assets can create quite lasting damage in communities, which is something I'm sure we've all seen, especially if you live in rural areas and you're totally reliant on maybe a last village pub or shop. And these can be quite social and economic impacts, and it really threatens provision of services in areas. And half of all the registered ACVs are local pubs, which probably might not come as a surprise. But it just shows the traditional community role of these establishments and the strength of local feeling to safeguard them. But despite this, even before the cost of living crisis, over 7,000 UK pubs have still been lost in the last decade. And this is obviously due to a combination of factors, but two key determinants are changes in drinking habits, but more importantly, the value of pub properties to developers. And that's where protecting assets comes in, really. And it's not just all about pubs. Of course, like village shops is another really popular asset that we see nominated. And meanwhile, the ACV criteria includes many other examples of assets, things like community centres, village halls, children's centres, allotments and public open spaces such as parks, things like libraries, swimming pools. I've even seen a community nominating a car park as well. So all of these things can be really, really important to a local community, and they're all valid. And the regulation also lists circumstances where land or buildings are exempt from inclusion. And I've listed some here. I won't read them out with the time we've got. But the contents of a building or the services or the building assets, that they're not covered either. So it's just the fabric of a building. It's not the contents. And of greatest significance, assets are only deemed of community value if they presently have community importance, or if they have done in the recent past, as I mentioned before. So in reality, this precludes many attempts to try and list what are seen as valuable assets from the past, say more than 5 years ago, which is a shame, really, because quite a few assets can be still important to a community. And as clarified, that local councils are eligible to nominate assets for listing. And the government did recognise that town and parish councils' role, it was really key to this in local communities. There's loads and loads of examples around the country, almost every council really. And many of you will be probably familiar with this first stage of the process, which is nominating an ACV. And this is made to your unitary or your district council, and its aim was to come from the community itself and give local people an opportunity to nominate those assets. And these nominations have got to include things like the reasons why the land's considered to be so important, a description of the nominated land and its boundaries, the names of the occupants of the land, which isn't always that easy sometimes, and those holding a freehold or leasehold estate of the land as well. So there's a lot of things that must be included. And if your nomination meets the definition, the local authority, in theory, they should list it as a nomination. And most councils have their own forms on their websites, as you can see here. So that there's no one type, but there's lots of different examples around the country. And there's a graph here of the process and some of the examples of the hundreds, thousands of town and parish council nominations of assets. But the process basically takes you to a system where you're very quickly going to be decided that you're not going to be up for nomination or not. So it's quite a simple process. And it's shown here in another way in a flow chart. And following receipt of a nomination, the local authority then has 8 weeks to make a judgment on whether the land or the building should be listed. And if it decides to meet the criteria and the process was undertaken correctly, then the authority must approve it and include it on its list of ACVs, and also on the local land charges register. And in case of any registered land, it has to apply for a restriction on the land register as well. So there are different elements to a listing that have to be taken into account. And then the principal council then has to give notice to the owner, to the occupier, if that's not the owner, the town or parish council in the area. So you should be getting notified of these, and also the nominating body if it's not from you. And if a nomination is not approved, the council's got to write to the nominator and give the reasons why. And just very quickly, provisions exist for appeals against the local authority's decision by the landowner. And there's all different levels of this. And the property owner may apply to local authority as well for compensation when listing of an asset might cause delays to a sale of theirs because of the moratorium periods that have been imposed. Although the owner of an asset may appeal against inclusion on the list, unfortunately, there's no provision for a council nominator or a community nominator to appeal if it's rejected. So this is a real anomaly, I feel. It's very much one way, the appeals process against the community that's nominating. And there's lots of different examples of successful nominations. Just have a look online. There's loads and loads. There's just one here from a parish council in Buckinghamshire of a pub, and that's actually still running. I don't think they acquired it, but it is still running. So it had some success there. And many of these nominations by parish and town councils, they are obviously pubs, and they can sometimes be the last community left in a village or town, as I said before. And where they have been saved, many have really diversified and played host to the village shops and post offices and lots of other services. And that's something that they often build into a business plan that's often been quite successful for funding. So you often have to think really creatively and innovatively when you want to repurpose a building for communities. And the community right to bid played a really statutory duty, or placed a statutory duty upon local authorities to maintain a register of all the successful ACVs. Now, some do this better than others, and the authority can determine the format of the list, which should be made publicly available online. And once listed, the relevant community must then be informed if they've been listed for sale within a 5-year listing period. And the authorities also got to issue a list of all the unsuccessful nominations as well, which can be quite interesting to look at. But they don't always have to give the reason online, which is a bit frustrating. And there's just some examples here from around the country. You can have a look at this on any principal authority that they'll have. It's funny that Mark from North Yorkshire mentioned he's here, and honestly, he's not a plant, but as I say, some are easier to use than others. And if I'm honest, I'd suggest that some authorities' efforts are somewhat half-hearted in terms of the way they demonstrate their registers. But this example from North Yorkshire is really excellent. It maps every asset and provides an easy-to-use link to each one with a map and information, which shows that it can be done to produce a user-friendly register. But unfortunately, I'd say the vast majority of these registers are not very user-friendly. But I have to say North Yorkshire's one is a real exemplar. And many town and parish councils also take the opportunity to include local listings on their websites. And there's just a few examples here. And I think this can be quite useful, really, just to indicate what assets there are within a town, in a village or a parish, and just given their subsequent status as well. So sometimes they might be unsuccessful, or sometimes they might have been sold on and the status changed. But it's just useful to have that for your town or parish. So what happens next after nomination? Well, the listing as well. These are just the first steps in gaining protection for a community assets value. And if you're fortunate, you might be able to negotiate an agreeable way forward with the owner. However, the great majority of nominations are made as last-ditch efforts to ward off threats, as you probably already know. And most often, these are from changes of use by property developers moving in. And this means that you might have to establish a bid to try and acquire the asset. And unless you've got a really well-prepared plan in place, it's likely your council is going to be reacting as rapidly as possible to try and transform your ideas and your business proposals into sort of firm plans and to come up with a bid. And not only will you need to consider funding, but very much you'll also have to consider about a business plan going forward to make it a viable business that you want to, and community business that you want to transform to. And if you haven't done so already, you'll need to quickly consult your community to agree the best use of the asset to meet local needs. So most organisations, especially for funders, are going to very much want to see community support and evidence of need. And then you'll be realistically in a position to start considering enacting a community right to bid. And once registered, assets remain on the authorities list for a maximum of 5 years, unless they're sold off after a moratorium period is triggered. And they must also keep a list of unsuccessful nominations for at least 5 years as well. And then after this period, the property is removed from the list, at which point it can be renominated and relisted, but subject to the same criteria. But I have to say that the authority might conclude that conditions for listing are no longer met. For instance, it might be seen then by that it's no longer an asset that has been used in the recent past because of those 5 years, which is a bit of a vicious circle, really. But there's other criteria that can come into play, which means that it's no longer deemed worthy. And you probably might have heard of I mentioned moratorium periods, but the community right to bid doesn't give the right of first refusal to buy an asset that's been successfully nominated. All it does is give you the time to put together the funding necessary to buy and to bid the asset on the open market. And that's if the owner wants to sell it. And if they do, they've got to tell the local authority of their intention to do so. And if your council is keen to develop a bid, it can then call for the local authority to trigger a moratorium period, during which time the owner can't proceed to sell the asset. So there's two periods, moratorium periods. Not so easy to say that. And both start from the date the owner tells the local authority of their intention to sell. So that's sort of like the ground zero date. And the first is the interim 6-week period, during which time a council or a community organisation can decide if they want to be considered as the potential bidder, and you express an interest in becoming potential bidders to buy it. So there's a form, and if that's received during this 6-week interim moratorium period by the authority, then they issue a further 4.5-month pause in the sale progress process that's triggered. So overall, you've got the interim 6-week period and 4.5 months, and overall that's 6 months in total. So that's basically the period that the owner can't really conclude a sale to anyone other than a local interest group. And this is the time when a council can develop a proposal and raise the money required to bid and buy the asset. And as I say, this doesn't mean the owner is restricted to selling to your council. It's just a delay in selling to any other party. And I've seen quite a few councils rushing to try and get some funding and a bid together. And it is very, very difficult in that timescale. I have to say, it's a very short timescale, especially given how a lot of these funding operators actually sort of have their timescales and processes. And just to clarify that sales process, if an asset included on the register is offered for sale, the right to bid is triggered. So as stated, you'll have up to 6 months to prepare your bid and complete to buy it. However, there's no community right to buy the asset, just to bid. And the act of listing the asset doesn't compel the owner to sell the asset, nor does it create any restriction on what they can do with it while they own it. So this means that your bid might not be the successful one, and the owner can, at the end of that 6-month period, sell to whoever they want to and for whatever price they choose. And if you can, you should really try to make contact with the owner to see if they have an interest in selling you the asset and what the sale details will be. That's just common sense, but there is no requirement that they must cooperate with you or your bid. So for instance, they don't need to provide you any information or even access to the property. And they can also be negotiating a sale with another preferred buyer during that 6-month period. It just means they can't conclude it during that time. So when I last delivered this training, I had to look long and hard. I had to look really long and hard at for successful bids for listed assets, and I had to confess that I found no examples anywhere of a local council successfully buying an asset, so a town or parish council. But there were some successful community bids, though, as you can see some on here. And there are other examples around the country, and most of these tend to be pubs, but not all of them. There were some other really interesting examples that you can find online. So what's changed this year then? Well, the government's £150 million community ownership fund has changed its criteria. And this was intended in part to help to support the ACV scheme, but it wasn't available to town or parish councils, which was a huge anomaly. And I really don't know what the reason for this was, but it's sort of probably one of the causes behind why the scheme was, to be honest, it was failing quite badly. The take-up just wasn't near good enough, although there were some bids that were successful, and especially almost all of them with support from the community ownership fund. But in May this year, and thanks largely to canvassing from NOUC, the national organisation, the grant opened up to local council applications too, and not before time. And you've probably seen all the publicity about it. It's been very much welcome. And this was the third round of a 4-year fund. And as you can see, there's a number of windows that open each round. And the last one closed last month in October. And there's another one, I think, in January. So we're nearly 3/4 of the way through the 4-year fund, but there's still a lot of opportunities for local councils. And in the first window of round 3, you may have seen the announcement that there were 8 successful applications from town and parish councils. And some of these are excuse me, quite substantial. There was nearly £1.8 million given to these 8 councils. So there's some really big amounts of money, and it's amazing what that can be achieved. And it's quite a big, diverse range of projects and assets that these councils have gone for. Of course, as part of the fund, applicants have still got to demonstrate the potential of their projects to protect the community asset that's at risk and preserve its community value and its use. And they've also got to develop a really sustainable operating model, as I mentioned before, just to secure its long-term future in community ownership. So this is very much about its feasibility and viability going forward. And while ACVs can be put forward, there's no requirement for an asset to be listed for this grant. So you don't have to go through that process. So that can be quite useful as well, especially if you identify assets in your community that you don't want to go through that process with. And however, apart from eligibility, there have been some major changes since the first 2 rounds. The match funding requirement has been reduced from 50% to 20%, which is a big thing. And the funding cap increased from £250,000 up to £2 million of capital funding, which is quite a big increase. But the average is still expected to be up to about £25,000. And I've just included a link there that there's a really good guidance video available on this NOUC Unlocking Opportunities webinar. It's on YouTube. So if you're thinking of applying, I really would watch that one first. And round 3 bidding window is from this week all the way through to the 31st of January. And the fund closes in March 2025. So there's not too much longer to go. And in the meantime, that there are some other funding opportunities. If you're lucky, your local principal council, like this one at Test Valley Borough Council, that they might provide grants. Otherwise, there's the usual funding sources such as landfill trusts like Veolia, and some of the lottery distributors such as Community Fund and Sports England. They have relevant grants available. And if not, there's always the loan option from organisations such as the Public Works Board, which I know that some councils have gone down that route. And going back to ACVs, there's lots of guidance available online for these. And My Community, which you've probably heard of, they have the go-to website, really, and it's a great free source on all steps of the process to taking ownership of assets of community value. And I've included some of the PDFs here, but do visit their website to find out more, because they are the sort of the font of all information, really, when it comes to this subject. And the Plunkett Foundation, I must say, I'd never heard of before I started work on this. And Locality, that they're the 2 main organisations behind My Community, the website online. And the foundation, the Plunkett Foundation, provides related support and resources that might be useful as well. So have a look at their website as well. They have some really good, interesting data. And if you're willing to really do the research, it's a remarkable sort of what other sources of specialist guidance and support and information you can find online. So whatever your type of asset, do have a look at at what's out there. You'd be surprised. And the big question, does the scheme work? Well, the delay to allow town and parish councils access to funding, I think, has been critical, but at least that has now been addressed. But the disappointing results for ACVs, I think it speaks for themselves, really. Although tellingly, there's officially no government information available about the rate of conversions of ACV listings and nominations into community ownership. There was a government-sponsored study back in 2016, which identified just 90 ACV listings that subsequently came into community ownership in the first 5 years. So that just means a conversion rate of just 15 assets for every 1,000 listed, which isn't great. And also around half of all nominations received are for pubs as well. But according to the Plunkett Foundation, by 2018, only 85 community pubs had actually been taken over by community organisations. So that's less than 2% of the total number that were pubs that were listed. And even then, many of these were on short-term leases rather than the acquisitions as wanted, or long-term leases. But on the positive side, that nominations for ACVs have proved really popular, with over 10,000 listed by 2018. And I think the figures there is over 15,000 now. So the scheme has really focused community attention to the value of local assets. And I found that in my own village, I really did. Particularly in terms of the benefits for the local economy, health and well-being. And also when we put together our neighbourhood plan, we started thinking of community assets in a way we hadn't before. So if nothing else, ACVs, they can provide as well a short-term layer of protection against the loss of local assets. And they also provide that narrow window of opportunity for community groups to pull together any funding that's needed to buy the asset out on the open market. But I think far too much of the focus has been on achieving that nomination and the perceived protection that this gives as a material consideration in planning. So with a few exceptions, listing an ACV doesn't provide the community with any real control over the property's use or its sale or its price. All the scheme provides is those extra 6 months to raise the funds and try to convince the landowner to sell them to them. And owners are often looking to sell for a profit, as we know, or development, rather than current use or social value. So they have very different values from your local community. And in such circumstances, local groups often can't make a competitive offer. And a listing doesn't even have to be taken into account by the local planning authority when it's trying to determine a planning application. So permission can be granted for a change of use, even for a listed asset. So time might be better spent influencing the drafting of a neighbourhood plan, especially if you're looking to upgrade your previous plan, which unlike an ACV listing, it's got to be given weight when considering planning permission. So that might be another way of addressing this as well. So sorry to be so negative about it, but I think it was a very flawed scheme with very interesting foundations to it. And I think John's going to be talking about mapping community assets later, but whatever you do with your own assets, it does pay to be proactive and try to list or map all the local places that matter or those with potential value. Even if you don't go down the route of nominating or trying to list ACVs, it can be a really worthwhile exercise. And every community has assets and potential within it, whether it be land and buildings, institutions and networks, but we don't always recognise what we have. And ultimately, a community usually knows its own assets better than anyone else. And asset mapping, it can be quite easy to do. And the main benefit is to get a collective view of what's important and make the most of what already exists. And you don't have to stick to the ACV criteria to do this. Just determine what assets you consider are most valuable in your own community. And there's some really excellent examples online of local engagement over asset mapping. I actually give a much longer presentation on this subject, 2-hour presentation, so we go into detail, especially on consultation, but it can be really, really useful. Oh, just some more photos there. And there's lots of guidance online for mapping community assets, and locality online that they provide some information that you can often find useful toolkits as well. There's one there from Preston City Council. But I was interested to see that Northampton, their county association, CALC, they tapped into a grant under the UK Community Renewal Fund. It'd be interesting if there is anyone here today from Northamptonshire. But part of the money is being used to map important community assets and services across the county. So it will be interesting to see how that goes. Okay, just a few more slides to go now, but I've talked about community asset transfer, and it's often confused or lumped together with ACVs. But it is something that's a scheme that's a lot more successful. And since 2006, government legislation has been strengthening legislation for community asset transfers, or CATs. And it's sometimes confused with the community right to bid, but in fact, it often runs in tandem. And this is the transfer of ownership of management of publicly owned assets. And it's a very proactive process that's entered into by public bodies to transfer community assets at less than the highest obtainable market value. And a range of agreements can be entered into. And I won't go into too much detail, but if it's done well, that there's really good benefits for your communities. And there's some good examples out there, which is why I've included Milton Keynes' strategy here, because I've been particularly impressed with their arrangements for service devolution and asset transfer policies in their area. It's really something worth looking at. I know NALC have actually used them quite a lot as a case study. And for some reason, I don't know why, but Milton Keynes seems to have that more developed system of devolution and catch that really work for both the principal council themselves, but also for the various local councils that they've got. And from my experience, the Localism Act was good in principle, but it was effectively carried out in conjunction with austerity cuts. And this seemed to mean that far too many local councils have experienced devolution by the back door with very little support and on the cheap. And we experienced that at my parish council. And Milton Keynes, however, show that it can be done well and it can be beneficial for everyone involved. And just very quickly now, there's lots of national advice available online, as usual, including this guide from Locality about community asset transfers. Okay, so with the late start, I rushed through that quite a lot, but just in summary, I think it's fair to say that it's a far from perfect scheme, the ACVs, but it does still provide opportunities. So it's important just to understand what makes an ACV, the role of town and parish councils in this process, how to nominate an ACV, and remember the 2 moratorium periods and the bid to purchase process. And it's difficult, but just try to be as prepared as possible if something does come up, because often we're sort of trying to fight fire really, but with very little time available to us, less than 6 months often. And most importantly now, that the sources of support and funding, and in particular, the access to the community ownership fund has changed things drastically. So try and be proactive there. And if you don't ask, you don't get with funding like that. So it's a great pot of money out there to tap into. And also be aware of the other opportunities afforded by mapping community assets, and also the catch, the transfers and the devolution, which you probably already come across with your own principal council. Okay, I've really rushed through that. I'm sorry about that. It's a bit of a rapid exercise, but